Anant, thank you for
Hi.
joining us for the summer school. Can you hear me?
Yes, Peter, thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I apologize in advance for my voice.
Don't
But
worry about it.
Anant, please would you introduce yourself to the students at our summer school?
Greetings, everyone. It's a great joy to be with all of you again. My name is Anant Rambachan. I am a professor of religion at St. Olaf College in Minnesota, United States. And my field of research, writing, and teaching is in the Hindu tradition. So I welcome this opportunity to be with all of you.
Thank you. Anant, Hinduism, like so many religious traditions, has memory as part of the structure and the basis of the religion. Would you share with us how significant is memory in Hinduism?
It is, you're quite right, Peter. It is a very significant matter in the Hindu tradition. And I can illustrate and speak about that in many ways. Let me start, for example, with memory and the sacred texts in our tradition. And I'm thinking particularly of the text that we speak of as the Vedas, and there are 4 Vedas. The Vedas are the sacred texts that are regarded as having the highest authority in the Hindu tradition. And if we go by some scholarly estimates, the oldest Veda text, the Rig Veda, is about 2500 BCE. And the verses of these texts were not put in writing in a written script until about the 9th century thereabouts. So that for most of their history, these texts were memorized and transmitted orally from teacher to student. This is very important. In a sense, the texts became embodied through memory, and it was believed that memory could be a more reliable method of preserving a text than writing. And this still continues. This tradition still continues today. In fact, it is not considered to be good if a priest performs a ritual and requires a written text with that performance of ritual. The priest should have the text in memory. Memory, I think, I would like to say also, Peter, is important in these texts for another reason. In addition to the significance of the meaning of the sacred text, what the words mean, these words are regarded as having an inherent power. They are sacred sounds. So you learn how to properly recite the text by hearing the text, hearing it chanted, recited by someone, by a teacher who has memorized the text and memorized and knows the right ways of reciting and chanting the text. So having the text in memory, I think, was a way of making the text readily accessible to human beings. You lived with the text. The text lived in you. It was embedded deeply in your memory. Sadly, I think I'm seeing even in the Hindu tradition the decline in a value for the memorization of text, because this requires a tremendous commitment. So that's one important way. I would say that memory also plays a role in, of course, in prayer, um, in the chanting and recitation of sacred texts. Parts, if one doesn't know a large chunk of the sacred text, but parts of these sacred texts are also used in Hindu daily prayer, and these will be recited from memory as well.
Is there a narrative that Hindus tell? Is there a story that you remember?
Well, there are many stories. Depends on, which tradition one is speaking about, and which text one is speaking about. But when growing up, I heard many sacred stories from my grandparents. And these were stories that they just told. They didn't read to us. They narrated to us, and they did that from memory. They had heard these stories, they had memorized the stories, and they transmitted these stories to us. So, I mean, there are so many of them, Peter. I don't know where to start.
Well, I don't know enough about it myself, so you'll have to help. But are there stories about the creation of?
No. Let me form the question as follows. I think Peter's question is coming from an Abrahamic perspective, where we have foundational narratives that provide the basis for the religion. Whether, as you just said, creation narratives, or story of the foundation of the people of Israel, or for Christians, the story of Jesus, there are foundational narratives. So they are remembered as part of the reliving and the reconstructing of the religious identity. Now, you've spoken about scriptures and their memory, but is there a narrative component that is as fundamental? In other words, I'd be grateful if you explain to our students, the role of the Puranas and the great epics, yes, which are memorialized, but still, do they play an equivalent role to the role of foundational stories and narratives in the three Abrahamic faiths?
Yes, thanks for that. Framing it in those terms. So you're quite right. If you ask me about a narrative in the same sense that you would have in the Jewish tradition, a creation narrative or a narrative of the community as a whole, I would find it very difficult. But you did go on to talk about narratives in texts like the Puranas or the epics. And yes, and I would say that most Hindu.
Please explain what these are, because while yes, I know most people listening to this conversation will not know what the Puranas and the epics are.
So when I speak about the epics, there are two major texts that I'm speaking about. One is the Ramayana, that tells the life story of Rama, who is believed in the Hindu tradition, especially by those who worship God as in the form of Vishnu, to be a divine incarnation. In Sanskrit, we speak of the incarnation as the avatar. And telling the story of the life of Ram, the narrative that centers on his life, is one that we've all heard growing up as children, and I think is an example of a narrative that continues to be told, because it's a really powerful narrative in so many ways about Ram and his devotion to his father's word, his choice of a life of 14 years in exile for the sake of preserving his father's honor, and the devotion of his wife Sita, who accompanies him into this exile. So it's a moral didactic story that continues to be transmitted to Hindu children by parents and grandparents, and is used, it's often cited even in contemporary contexts to speak about human obligations, about core values and right ways of acting in the world.
So going back from those foundational epics to the question of, do they play an equivalent role to what we have in the Abrahamic faiths? In other words, is the content of what is remembered? You're a Hindu professor, but you teach in a Lutheran college, so you rub shoulders with Christians, so it's easy for you to understand the question. Would you consider that there is an equivalent role to memory, or is the order of importance and magnitude of the content of memory different?
I think the latter. Because the Hindu tradition, as you know so well, is a very diverse tradition. Of course, India is a diverse land, and the sense of a shared Hindu identity, or even the word Hindu itself, and Hinduism as a name for this tradition, is a much later development. What we speak of as Hinduism is really a family of traditions. And so while a narrative like the story of Ram that I mentioned in response to Peter's question is one that is widely known and widely shared, it is not so much a story that serves the purpose of reinforcing identity as there may be stories in other traditions. It's a powerful moral story that is used for teaching purposes, for didactic purposes, but not so much for preserving a sense of a shared identity or community identity.
So
I'm not sure.
The identity is the shared memory of the sacred texts of the Vedas.
Yes. It is centered on the narrative that is found in a sacred text that embodies a certain values, certain right ways of being.
So actually, you said that it plays less of a role than memory would in Abrahamic tradition, yet to the extent that narrative and what is remembered shapes identity here, it shapes identity there, then the perspective of identity formation, the functions are fully equivalent.
Functionally, but I was trying to sort of clarify, because I know, I think you mentioned in your question, a story of the Exodus that is part of your tradition. This is a story about the Jewish people, and helps to shape the Jewish identity. So there isn't a the story of Rama is not told so much as a story of the Hindu people, that collective sense of identity formation. It's an important story, as I said, widely shared, but not and for moral instruction.
I wondered whether we could move back to rituals. You mentioned them in your early statement, but the relationship between rituals and remembering. And maybe you can illustrate this with a couple of examples.
Um, yes, I think, Peter, we have a Hindu calendar that we follow, a Hindu ritual calendar, and that depends a lot also, as you suggest, on memory. So, as part of this calendar, we have each day of the week is connected with a particular form of God, a particular name of God that we should remember. So Mondays, for example, is traditionally associated with goddess Shiva. So on a Monday morning in my home, we will recite uh, prayers or mantras and perform rituals centering on the nature of God as Shiva. And in the same way, Wednesdays for God in the form of Krishna. So, it's important that memory plays a vital role in that process. And we also celebrate, in the calendar, the birth anniversaries of people like I mentioned Rama of the Ramayana, Krishna of the Bhagavad Purana. We have days in our calendar when we honor our teachers. We have occasions in the calendar when we must honor and remember our departed ancestors. So all of these are occasions that require exercise, and we see the fountain of memory active.
You've just mentioned great individuals, great people in your tradition. I assume different branches of Hinduism remember different people.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could just share with us, first of all, who you remember and how you remember those people, and how that might affect the type of Hinduism that you practice.
Yes, so that's a correct assumption. So in the Hindu tradition, you have, figures that are sort of pan-Hindu and who are remembered. But there is also, as your question suggests, very specific memories depending on which tradition you belong to. In Sanskrit, we use the word sampradaya. So there are different streams. A sampradaya is a particular theological stream. And so if I personalize, my own practice, so I belong to the sampradaya or stream that we speak of as Advaita, or the non-dual theological stream. So I have a teacher who is no longer alive, but I would remember him in a very special way on the occasion of the day of Guru Purnima. It's the Sanskrit name, the day of remembering the teacher, honoring the teacher. Now, if he was a living teacher and I could, I would visit him on that day. I would go to see him. I would take a gift for him as a way of expressing my gratitude to him. But one of the main theologians of that tradition lived in the 8th century. His name is Shankara. So his birth anniversary is also very special for us. So we will perform rituals in his honor, and we might engage, or we are advised to engage in some study as a way of honoring him as a teacher. So the particular sampradaya or stream, the theological stream, also, yes, you're right, informs, you know, who we remember when we remember.
And these great teachers that you remember, do
Yes.
they teach different styles of Hinduism, different values within Hinduism? Where did the differences
Yes, of course they differ in the sense that they have, I mean, they're great interpreters of the tradition, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them, you know, wrote elaborate commentaries on our sacred texts. And so these interpretations form the theological bedrock, the theological ground for the distinctive teachings of that particular tradition. So Shankara, who I mentioned, and who is the primary teacher, interpreter for the tradition to which I belong, which is a Hindu non-dual tradition or Advaita. You know, he's a teacher to whose commentaries we look as being foundational. Other traditions have other theologians, so like Ramanuja is another well-known name, and so on.
I can't. There you go. Fine. I'm unmuting myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, Alan, go ahead, please.
Okay. Your earlier answer was very interesting because it allows us to profile something about the uniqueness of Hinduism and memory. You commented on remembering God, and you commented on the notion of mantra. Now we have so far scripture, we have guru or teacher,
yes,
and we actually have now God in all this and specific ways of remembering God. One of the things that we're discovering as we're holding these interviews with teachers is that some traditions profile memory very strongly on history, and some profile it more on some higher aspects of spiritual reality. And I believe that the case of Hinduism is very strongly in the direction of the ultimate focus of memory being on God, and all these different other elements contributing to it. This is in part why history itself is less important, but you also noted the notion of mantra, which is a recitation of the divine name, and therefore you memorialize and inscribe within yourself the reality of the divine through a technique of memorialization. So could you tell us more about the place of remembering God? And part B, could you tell us about how mantra functions as a means of memorialization?
Yes. So maybe it might be useful to just, I'll preface my answer to your question more specifically by saying first that we have 5 daily obligations as Hindus that frame our lives. These are called Mahayagnas, Pancha Mahayagnas, the 5 great obligations of Hindu daily life. And the first is remembering God, the Deva Yajna, Deva here meaning God. And secondly, the Brahma Yajna, which is remembering the teachers, especially the Guru. Third is Pitra Yajna, remembering the elders, the ancestors, those who are no longer with us, but those also who are here. The fourth is Manushya Yajna, remembering other human beings in our lives, and our connectedness to them. And the fifth and final is the Bhuta Yajna, which is the remembering nature. And to remember each of these is also an invitation to express gratitude. So memory here is connected with a reminder that we need to be grateful to God, to teacher, to other human beings, to ancestors, and to the world of nature. So coming now to the first great obligation, which is the obligation to God or the remembering of God, you're quite right. This takes the form in the Hindu tradition, takes a prayerful form of remembering God through God's names, which would be enshrined in what you quite rightly referred to as a mantra. So the mantra is a special prayer, and every mantra has the name, one of the names or more of the names of God. But every mantra is something that would be whispered in the air of the student by the one who is his or her guru. So every Hindu would at some point in his or her life be accepted as a disciple of a guru. And part of the relationship between the teacher and the student is the fact that the student will receive these sacred words or this mantra from the guru, from the teacher.
Anant, I have to interrupt you here. We
Yes.
have to close this meeting and come into a new one, because the meetings only can last 40 minutes and we spend a lot of time getting in. So we're going to end, come back into exactly the same address. Okay? Close.
So I must close. I will close off.
Unended, and we all come back in.
I must close also.
We all have to.
Okay.